So today I'm going to take you through the Minnesota and Wisconsin joint. What we did was we reviewed and rewrote basically all of the border water regulations on the Mississippi River portion of the border between the states. And Catfish was a portion of that. If you have questions on any of the other portions or more in-depth questions, feel free to contact me out of here if it's not something I cover. And then I finally want to leave you with a few thoughts on the main topic here on public input in a post-public meeting world. Before we go into that, though, I really need to make sure I acknowledge both a lot of staff at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, without which we couldn't have done this, both at the the field level where we conducted these meetings and collected the data, and at the state capital levels and the state agency heads where we were able to work together to get this accomplished. So first we'll take a look at the area where this applies to. It is an area running from Hastings, Minnesota in Pool 3 down to the Iowa border. All of that border water was under this review process. We initially started working with Iowa, and they're coming together apparently with a subsequent modification as well, but this is just going to cover the Minnesota-Wisconsin portion. So regulations have been in place on this section of this section of water for a long time. This is a breakdown of when each of the species was last adjusted. Regulations basically have been in place for a maximum of 80 and a minimum of 42 years. So they're kind of generational regulations. One good way to look at that is this photo that was taken in 1962, fishing below Loch and Dam 8. Essentially, most of the regulations that were on that last slide were in place for 1 to 2 decades already by the time this was taken. Interestingly, catfish was not one of them. The catfish bag at the time was 8 here. Currently, it's 25. So this is a broad review of regulations. We didn't want to do a species-specific regulation. We were looking to do the entire batch at once because we knew that there were highly vocal groups that I'll talk about in a minute that would have had us do one, but then we would have never been able to accomplish the others. So we wanted to do everything at once. And there were complexities working between the two states, trying to get everything lined up where we could do this together. The first problem that we encountered was this lateral management of a longitudinal resource. We obviously have the river that runs down, but we have borders that meet in the middle. That's not an uncommon thing. 45 states in the District of Columbia share at least some riverine border. Some of those have areas where one state controls most of the river, but in general, we know that fish and anglers both move extensively, and so that it becomes something where you have multiple states and agencies needing to come together and make these regulations. The consistent regulations are usually desired by the public, where everything is the same across the water, but goals and opinions may not align among the agencies, the governments, or the anglers that are being managed by those regulations. One good example, when we were doing these surveys, Minnesota anglers tended to desire more restrictive bag limits than Wisconsin anglers. But that was a change between the constituencies, and we needed to account for that in our regulations. There was public pressure to protect these populations. They fell into kind of 2 general areas. We had walleye and sunfish folks that were very broad, generally very broad groups that wanted to protect it, but they weren't all that noisy, except when they were politically connected. And that was where our issue was going to come. We were going to get walleye and sunfish regulations probably forced upon us if we didn't take proactive measurements ourselves. Catfish actually fell into the opposite group. It was a pretty small group, but they were extremely vocal, and in some cases they were also politically active, although not so much just on the border waters. As I mentioned, we wanted to be proactive, and we wanted to be proactive in 2 ways, really. We wanted to head off that chance of legislative action that would have forced something beyond our control. And we also wanted to be proactive because we realized that the river is facing a lot of stressors. We have loss of habitat, we have climate change, all of those stressors that are being put on this population. Even those regulations have been in place for 80 years in some cases. We don't know where the tipping point was on some of those regulations for being a problem. And we've got it in Minnesota. We have a fair amount of experience with large-scale fisheries issues on some of our larger lakes, and we really didn't want to try to recover a fishery. We wanted to protect it in advance. And then we had non-uniform data availability. We have a couple of these pools that have pretty extensive sampling on them due to some larger programs. I'm the large lake specialist, so I focus largely on Lake Pepin and Pool 4. We have a ton of annual data from that pool, but almost nothing on some of our other pools. But the regulation needed to cover the whole system because that was desired by the public, a uniform regulation. So the first step was to get angler opinions, and we wanted to do that on the quality of the fishing currently in the Mississippi River, bag and size limits, and then potential changes to bag and size limits. But we did not put any specific regulation proposals in that question because we didn't want to drive immediate backlash against something that we had suggested. And that brings us to the second problem. How are we going to collect that public input? So we opted to start with public meetings, but you could also use mail surveys or electronic surveys. How about Siri? I mean, it's been around for 10 years. We could have Siri ask everybody what they wanted to fish for. It's only been around 10 years. Where are we going to be in the next 10 years? That's kind of the question that we wanted to get to with some of what we're presenting here. And that briefly brings us to problem 3. How do you let the public know that you're collecting that input? And we'll come back to that in a minute after we talk about how we did our initial collection. So we had 5 public meetings that we held in May of 2018 up and down the river. We used an audience response system, which was really good for our public meetings. It was by Turning Point Technologies or Turning Point. It allowed us to collect an individual answer from every single attendee without one particularly loud attendee driving the conversation in a public meeting. So we were able to rapidly collect a lot of data from those people. They use basically a little clicker and they select what was on the screen. One of the nice things is it gave them these graphs, so they had instant feedback that we could use for follow-up questions, and they got to see what the results were right on the spot. And then we followed that up with 3 open house style meetings in November after we had developed proposed regulations based on the input initially and on the data that we had. We had used these 3 open house style meetings, and that was to test the acceptance of proposed regulations. So our initial online input form, we knew we wanted to do one. We initially started with a fillable PDF option. We ran into a lot of problems with that. It had serious integration issues, primarily with Apple devices. They would send in something they had spent a bunch of time filling out, and it would be empty when it got to us. So that caused a lot of issues. Ultimately, Google Forms was what we ended up using. This is what the input looked like. It also generated nice little graphs like that for us. It fully integrated with Google Sheets, which then could be easily exported to Excel. It provided the best data flow, and it was universally accepted by all the devices. We had no issues with any of this after we switched over to this system. It had options to prevent duplicates. You could collect email addresses for follow-up questions if you wanted to. It was adaptable to different question types, multiple choice all the way through comments that were paragraph-sized comment sections. And one of the other unique things about it is it allowed us to work between states. Each state had their own kind of proprietary stuff that they used. This, we could go back and forth between the 2 state agencies without any issue. The state agencies didn't always like it, but we were able to do that. And that brought us, I'm sorry if you can't see this this was a question about how many of you attended one of these open house meetings. And you can see that 91.5% did not attend a meeting. And that's where we come to that post-public meeting world kind of issue. We need to collect information from folks that aren't willing or aren't able to go to public meetings. So here's our breakdown. The meetings went well, but the attendance was poor. We had about 100 people that attended those first 5 public meetings and 66 in the second round of open houses. And you can see our staff times there. Ultimately, it comes down to about a little bit less than 1 response per staff hour of time for our effort there. And when we switched over to the digital versions, even with the slowdowns that fillable PDF thing caused us, we were up to 37 in the first survey, and with a little bit more effort and experience and a shorter questionnaire, we got that up to 112.5 by the second survey. So that first survey was 76 questions long. It was sizable. We were able to collect that in an hour in the meeting, and I'll touch base on it a little bit later, but we were finding that the folks were able to fill that out in 10 to 15 minutes when they did it themselves. And that brings us back to this problem 3, how do we let the public know we're collecting this data? So news releases and public notices are kind of the standard bread and butter way of getting out the public meeting kind of question. We have a tracking software that works with ours in Minnesota. The news release for those initial meetings, we sent out to 361 media outlets. We know that 115 of them opened that document, and we know, as far as we know, only 6 of them ran the story. We can't force them to run the news. It's just not something we can do. So how do you get that information in front of folks? In addition to the fact that newspaper readership is highly skewed to older folks, which was very obvious in our meetings. I'd say our average age was between 65 and 70 in the public meetings, but our average age on the online stuff was across the board. But I shouldn't say average age. Our age range was across the board. Some other possible things, you could be buying targeted ads. That's one thing that we need to think about. How do we get this right in front of the people we want? You can do that via Google. We looked at DNR website and social media. In Minnesota, our issue is that we have a very small number of people that are allowed to post things on social media and control those accounts, and it just wasn't flexible enough to be responsive. Additionally, the people that are allowed know nothing about what we're talking about. So we have to feed that through them. This is a breakdown of how the surveys came back from that initial Google form survey. We did those meetings in May. We let this into the wild, so to speak. We put the links out in the beginning of July, and this is through the month of July. That's our news release, that little tiny blip there. That's what we got out of our news release. These 2 blips were some internet forums and the stories that were released as a part of that news release. That was our first Facebook release when we first got some traction. And then this big bump is from the Minnesota DNR news release and social media release that came all in one day. That has some advantages, we think, over what we did in Minnesota, because it has Wisconsin has a big group of people that can get push text messages, and they sent text messages out to anybody who had selected the Mississippi River as their interest, and that message had the link to our survey. So when they got it, they could click on the link and immediately take the survey, like I said, in 10 or 15 minutes. It allowed for quick turnaround of that information. So this is where the state processes part ways. In Minnesota, we opted for an expedited rulemaking process. It's one of our standard rulemaking processes that just allowed us to go a little bit faster so we could hopefully integrate and initiate these regs at the same time as Wisconsin. In that process, we put out a request for comments. We got 30. There's 2 ways to look at this. Either one, we really understood the position of our constituents based on our stuff, which was all done outside of our standard process. By the way, everything we've talked about is outside of our standard process. So we either understood them so well that nobody had any issues, or beforehand, we would have been making choices on 140 miles of river based on 30 people. And that's where we would have been. And that's probably more realistic, because that's about what we would get for an average reg change on a big system. So we think that's one of the biggest arguments for collecting better and more complete public input. So as I said, this is a typical rulemaking process and one of the problems with how we currently collect that input. Wisconsin, they used their standard rulemaking process, which involves something called the Conservation Congress Spring Hearings. For anybody who isn't aware, Wisconsin has this system where they have meetings on the same day in every county across the state for all proposals that the DNR has for the year. And they vote on them publicly. In 2019, that was the first year they allowed digital voting in that process. So they actually were making kind of this leap at the same time as us. The catfish regulation proposal, which was a bag of 10 combined between flathead and channel, with 1 catfish over 30 inches per day. It failed at 6 of the 72 public meetings in the counties, the actual meetings in the counties. Mostly at meetings that had low turnout, sometimes as low as 4 people. It's really easy to fail when you only have 4 votes. In the meetings statewide, it had 75% support roughly, and that was out of over 2,000 people. The online online input statewide had 78.3% approval out of another 4,200 people roughly. And so overall, we had 77.1 support from almost 6,300 people in that system, and that was for 5 questions. If you add that in with the input that we got with our initial stuff, we had over 100,000 individual responses to these surveys, providing us input on all these different species. So this brings us around to implementation. The regulations passed in both states and they'll be implemented this spring. We actually got news while we were on the flight from Dallas here that we were approved in Minnesota for an implementation as early as March 1st. We're probably going to delay it to April 1st because that's when Wisconsin was going to, so we can go in together without any issues, and then we will go from there. So that brings us back to that initial topic, looking forward, how do we collect this type of information in the future? There's some things that we're using currently, well, not we. Wisconsin is using, the Wisconsin DNR is using Facebook Live meetings, which are similar to the public meetings, only presented electronically, obviously, and it can be recorded and then people can watch them later. Automated meeting planning is a little bit farther kind of in the future. It's a little bit more out there. It uses crowdsourcing software basically to look at the public, use some data mining to say when is the best time to have a public meeting, whether it's electronic or physical, when and where would you get the highest maximum input from your public meetings that you already have. And frankly, it's a little bit farther in the future, but chatbots, I think, are one of the things that have the most potential for us. They're currently capable of answering simple questions. You probably dealt with them if you shopped online, that little box in the corner that says, you left this in your cart. Do you want to ask a question about it? Or do you have any questions today? Currently, they're capable of some basic answers, but in the near future, they could very well provide interactive personal experience via text or voice for anybody who was watching one of those public meetings digitally or doing something even just outside of that. It has a lot of advantages. It can deal with many users at the same time. If you're doing a public meeting and somebody has a basic question, they could type it in and it could answer that question without you having to stop your meeting. And you could do that for 100 people all at the same time. Or if you have somebody that's a third shift worker and they can't come to any meetings, they're watching a pre-recorded meeting, they could answer that same question at 3 a.m. without having to wait and call you right away in the morning when you get up. So in summary, we have current methods that are often not effective at collecting public input currently, but they may be legally required. We have to do them because of our processes, but they obviously aren't bringing in as much or as broad a selection of public input as we might like. And we have electronic options utilizing the mobile devices and social media that will likely boost those responses. But uniform distribution of the population is not assured by this. It's not a scientific sampling method. But I would argue that we're already not universally sampling our system. We're already skewed to higher age groups with these public meetings, skewed to newspaper readers when newspapers are dying. This collects more information, and that gives us a broader idea of what the public is interested in. And then those ones that I just went over, those Star Trek options, they might be available soon, but they will require that agencies embrace them. As I said, in the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, we have a pretty tight funnel on who can deal with our social media. I'm guessing they're not going to want us putting together chatbots that are going to be out and talking to folks online without a little bit more control. So we need to embrace those as agencies if we want to bring that technology forward. Otherwise, we'll be chasing the technology into the future, and we won't ever be able to use it as it saturates the market. And then the final thing is it's doubtful that any one technology will be able to reach everyone. We're not going to get rid of public meetings, but we need to be able to supplement it if we want the broad scale ability to collect this data. And finally, these are my kids. They're in this picture, they're 1 and 3, or 2. They're 2 and 4 now. I don't know what they're going to be providing in public input on, but I'm afraid if we don't get our act together and become more modern in how we collect it, they're not going to be able to provide their public input at all. So we have to be thinking about that going into the future. I'm happy to answer any questions about this or any of the other stuff if I have any time.
Yeah, thank you. We got 1 minute, so if somebody's got a question.
Yep.
Did you offer any on your Google Forms in any other languages?
We did not offer it in other languages. We did choose to contact representatives of certain groups, like we have a strong Southeast Asian community in Minneapolis, and we made sure that our conservation officers that are liaisons with that community made sure that the folks knew about it. It's something that certainly could be done. I don't know what Google Translate had the capability of doing, if somebody could have done it on that end. but we did not specifically know.
All right, thank you.